Hello there, YouTube. This is Mr. Gibson Guy. Thank you for stopping by the channel, having a look here. I've been kind of busy working on music videos the last couple of weeks. Haven't done anything in photography, so I wanted to get a photography video going here. I have done several, again, for my photography, I do film photography from the 1970s and 1980s, concentrating on that time period before we went into the autofocus and then the digital era of cameras. So I'm kind of stuck in a time zone here that never goes anywhere. It's always 1983 right here. So anytime you want to drop by 1983, come on by. We'll be there. It's right behind me, right there. You can see lots of it. Let me just say this. I buy and sell cameras and make camera videos, and I collect cameras, and I sell some of the stuff that I get. I keep a lot of the stuff that I get. And then there's some other stuff that's kind of in there. But one thing that I don't do is I don't sell broken stuff. But sometimes when you're buying old equipment like this, you get stuff that's not working. And the stuff that's not working is good for display, or it's good to be able to use as an example on a YouTube video. But it's not... you know, it might be worth something to somebody for parts, and we'll look at some of that with what we're looking at today. But so not everything that I have behind me is working. I would like to have it that way, and it kind of pains me that some of it's not. Some of the stuff I can fix, some of the stuff I force myself to try to fix, and some of the stuff I have enough sense to stay away from and let that be handled by somebody that really knows what they're doing. But basic stuff I can fix. But I don't sell somebody something that I just patch together. I won't sell it unless it's something that really works. Then, you know, other than that, it's destined to be in the cabinet for the rest of my life, and then my daughter can figure out what to do with it when I'm gone. So today, I have had a lot of response and views on the subject of motor drives and auto winders, or auto winders and motor drives. I've done several on Canons and on Minoltas and on Olympus especially, and a little bit of Nikon. But today I'm making a video that's just kind of tells the history of the Nikon separate motor drive, not partial part of the camera, but an attachment, and the times that they were there. And I'm going to try to go through in chronological order with this and try not to forget anything. Now, let me also just make one last note here. The term auto winder and motor drive is kind of something that they can overlap each other. Is this a motor drive? Is this a motor drive? Is this an auto winder? How do we know the difference? So the most obvious difference is that the general rule is if you have a motor which is powered by 4 AA batteries, that means you have a 6-volt motor. That's most likely going to be an auto winder. Whereas if you have a camera that takes 8 AA batteries, that's going to be a 12-volt motor, and that would be a motor drive. Motor drives also could go up to 15 volts, and there's a couple right behind me that are actually 18 volts. Those are definitely motor drives. But for example, generally a 6-volt motor is going to turn your camera, is going to cycle your shutter and film at about 2 frames per second. The motor drives start out about 3.5 frames per second, which is just about roughly double, or 5 frames per second, 5.5 frames per second, 6 frames per second. But they're like the Olympus Winder 1 that they came out with in the early 70s is only a single shot. You press it down like for a semi-automatic, like for each exposure. You can't just, if you hold it down, it just stays there on the first exposure. But if you bounce your finger fast enough on a Winder 1, on your OM1 or OM2 or OM10 or whatever, you can get it to about 3 frames per second. But that's only a 4-cell motor auto winder, so it's definitely in the auto winder category. But you can actually have it faster than some motor drives that are out there that are kind of in the low 3s. But we're going to go with the 6 volt, 12 volt, 6 volt or 12 volt and on up. So we're talking about Nikon motor drives, and Nikon started the whole thing with their Nikon F, first professional camera, that came out in 1959, and then they started adding things to it like light meters and motor drives and flash units and stuff like that. They started hanging stuff on there and adding to the versatility of what the camera could do. Now, these cameras were expensive. They were designed for pros, and so Nikon sold a lot because they were well known, because everybody who was a pro was using a Nikon if they were shooting 35mm photography film. But Nikon also wanted to be in business, and they were selling expensive cameras, but they were kind of specialists in that, and they kind of wanted to get into the amateur market. And so along the lines of, well, we've been making this F for a while, in the 1960s. Could we make a streamed down version that would be less expensive? And so they worked on that, and they came down with a more consumer-oriented version of the F, which they called the FTN. And they didn't call it a Nikon, they call it a Nikor Mat. You'll see both of them. I've had several of them. The FTNs are very common because the things are just tough as nails and they will last almost forever. So people are still using them commonly. And I've had some and I've sold them, and then I have had some other Nikor Mats, which we're going to look at next, and sold those, but I still have one, and I've been holding on to it so I can use it for this, because the Nikor Mat FTN was just a streamlined efficiency version of the original F. Didn't have removable finder, didn't have all the stuff you could do with it. It was just more of a basic one, and it was more of it for general photography enthusiasts. You could have a Nikor Mat. It's almost as good as having your Nikon, but the Nikon is really expensive. And then as things advanced through the 60s, Nikon was selling a lot of Nikor Mats. That's obvious because they're all still out there. None of them have gone anywhere. They're still going. And then they said, well, let's come up with something else, because we had something else that was happening in photography, and that was the beginning of auto exposure instead of manual exposure. And so that was not something the pros were ever going to use, so they said back then, but amateurs and the hobbyists might very well like one. And so they came up with this. This is the Nikor Mat EL, and this is one of the early original ones. It says EL up in this little pyramid on the top of the pentaprism. And remember that, because we're going to see that again in a few minutes here. This one, I'll show you the bottom because that's part of the story here. It has a tripod socket, and it has a little button for rewind and nothing else, because this is from the mid-60s, and the EL gave the Nikon photographer a Nikomat that had auto exposure. But another common feature hadn't become common yet. It was just starting to show up, and that was the development of the auto winder. That one doesn't take an auto winder, so I don't have one. Here's an auto winder, very simple. Takes 4 AA batteries in here, and you have a little screw that you turn that screws it into the tripod socket, and then you have a little key that spins here, and that's what winds the film. And you got a little pin to line it up with. Very simple thing. This one, of course, is a Minolta. Minolta did some great auto winders. But Nikon, after they had this EL for a while and there was a lot of demand for auto winders, they modified it and they made an ELW, which means an EL that takes a winder, and it would have a little socket here with a key that turned so that the auto winder could wind the film inside the camera. So that would be there. That's an ELW, and it came out with what Nikon used terminology was an AW1, which meant an auto winder 1. And so they had a lot of interest in that because here you could get a fairly reasonably priced Nikon called the Nikomat, and you could get auto exposure feature on your camera. And then you could even get an auto winder if you got an ELW, and which later turned into the not Nikomat but Nikon EL2, was continuation of that when they dropped the Nikomat name. But the problem was that this auto winder that they made for the ELW and the Nikon EL2 was not a very good auto winder. It was very noisy. It had mostly brass gears, but for some reason Nikon stuffed in a plastic or nylon gear in amongst all the metal gears, and it would rip it up real fast when they used that. So the auto winder kind of got a bad name because the camera was good, but if you got the auto winder with it, you're going to knock your auto winder out. Now, this is another thing that we're going to talk about in a minute, but as time went on, there had been a lot of ELWs and Nikon EL2s and a lot of winders, and the fix for the winder was that you could get a all metal gear that Nikon used in another motor that we're going to look at next. But all these people that needed the gear for their auto winder, these had to come from somewhere, and Nikon wasn't selling them. So it came down to cannibalizing here. Alright, so we saw the AW1, the auto winder. Then we never saw the F, because I don't have an F. I've had one a long time ago, but I'm not real that thrilled with it. This was, when I was first starting in photography, just the thing. This is the Nikon F2. This particular one happens to be an F2A. My very first Nikon was an F2 Photomic that I bought back in the very early 80s after the F3 came out, because you could get an F2 at that point. But this is a really cool camera, really massive camera, you can see. And you know, all this is kind of amazing when you think that little tiny 35mm negatives, well, all this is for. This is where the motor drive started becoming much more part of the camera. The F36 motor didn't have a very advanced clutch in it, so it was tearing the film off the spool all the time and getting to be a real pain. But they started perfecting their clutches in their motor drives so that you could get 5 frames per second and you could get to the end of the roll and probably still have the film taped onto the spool so you could rewind it, or in the case of if you had your motor drive, this one doesn't, but the earlier ones had a rewind button that would and it would rewind the film on back into the canister that it came from. So you just pop open the back and you were ready for it. This is another example of one of these cameras that the camera works and the motor sort of works, but it doesn't function. And the reason for that is, well, there were 3 different motor drives that went on the F2. The original was called the MD1. We're going to use the Nikon nomenclature. The MD1, which was chrome around the corners and not all black like this one. And that lasted for about a year, and they had some switching problems with it, so they had to change around the circuitry a little bit, and they came up with the MD2, which was the same exact thing as the MD1, except that little circuitry change in it. And then later on, the MD1 and the MD2 had all sorts of controls over here, knobs to turn and everything like that, so you could set it to how many exposures you wanted to take before it automatically shut off and things like that. But it was expensive and it was complicated, and photographers wanted to concentrate on taking their photos, getting the right shutter speed, the right aperture, the right focus, and the right composition for their pictures. You know, these other things, they didn't want to think of all the different controls they had to control on the back of their motor drive. So Nikon listened to the photographers, and they came out with this motor drive, which is all black, doesn't have chrome around part of it, and this is called the MD3. Right there, yeah. I think that's in focus. You can see it, Nikon MD3. And this was kind of cross between an auto winder and a motor drive. This does not rewind like the MD2 and the MD1 did. It doesn't rewind your film. You have to just do that the old-fashioned way, like that. And it just had one little window that gave the readout of what it was set on, and one wheel that you turned to set the window to where you wanted it to go. And other than that, it was all flat, so it didn't bother you. So this was a real popular motor drive. Not quite as fast, but much less expensive, and it did what the photographer wanted it to do. Wind the film fast. That was what they were interested in. Now, unfortunately, remember that AW1 I was talking about, the auto winder that had a nylon gear? Well, the gear in metal that was the exact replacement for that nylon gear in the AW1 happens to be inside the MD3. That's what this is. The MD1 and MD2 were the fancy, expensive motor drives, and the MD3 was the one that people wanted because it just wound the film, and that was all you wanted it for. But unfortunately, these have been cannibalized. If I put the 8 batteries in here, that battery compartment on each side, if I put the 8 batteries in here and turn it on, it will the motor will come on, and it'll just keep buzzing and buzzing and buzzing. That's because it's turning against a missing cog, which somebody took out long ago. And that's why you can get these motor drives pretty cheap. They look great, and they're pretty light because there's no need to put many batteries in them. It's not going to go anywhere, but unfortunately those have been cannibalized, so I have to start my search for finding a brass gear that will go into this MD3 so I can put it to use maybe someday. But I'm glad I have it, so it makes my F2 look pretty bad, doesn't it? Alright, so we're going through here, and we are in the 70s because the F2 came out in 1972. But something else happened in 1972 after the Nikon F2 came out, that massive thing that we saw. And what that was this. This is the Olympus OM1. And this one happens to have the auto winder on it. And the camera with the auto winder on it is about the same size and weight as that F2 without the motor drive and battery pack. So this was Olympus's big attack on photography in 1972 when they came out with this compact little camera. And so all of a sudden everybody had to have a compact camera. Olympus, when they came out with the OM1, was hardly even known as a camera manufacturer. They made little half-frame cameras, and then their great designer, Matani, said, we need to make a small SLR full-frame camera. And they came out with it, and it was a tremendous hit, and everybody else had to come up with smaller cameras. That included Nikon. Well, Nikon in the early 70s was selling Nikromat FTNs and Nikromat EL2s or ELWs and Nikon EL2s, but they were big and heavy, and there was this big call for compacting down cameras. And so the Nikon engineers went to work and they took the Nikromat FTN and they shrunk it down into a little tiny platform, and they called the first one the Nikon FM. And it was a much smaller, lighter weight camera. It was not quite as heavy duty, and it was not as large, but everybody loved these cameras. First they had the FM, then they followed it promptly with the FE, which was the Nikromat EL2 or ELW compacted down into the very same platform as the FM. And these were extremely popular cameras. They came out with motor drive. Now remember, let's look at our nomenclature. With the F2, with the F1 we had the F36 motor drive. With the F2 we had the MD1, MD2, and MD3. So we're looking for an MD4, but they didn't use the MD4. They went to a 2-digit designation, and this one was called the MD11. Come on, focus there. Yeah, we got it. There, MD. This old Sony just focuses for me so good. And the MD11 was a motor drive that contained the battery pack inside. It held 8 batteries, so it's a 12 volt. And let's see, continuous. This one goes, yeah, that was pretty fast. Or you can set it to single, like that, or turn it off. And this was the MD11. They ran this for a couple of years. It fit the FM and the FE, both of them. The cameras were interchangeable with them, which can be helpful if you're testing them. But they had a little bit of a problem with the MD11. It worked fine. It was a great motor drive and very popular, even for the pros. Everybody wanted one of these. But the one problem that they had with the MD11 was on the FM, not the FE, but on the FM, if you left the switch on the motor drive and you put the camera into your camera bag and put it on the shelf for a week and you took it out, you would have dead battery in your camera because the switch would keep the camera's circuitry on, so the light meter stayed on even though there was no light and it wasn't taking a picture. So they changed around the switch in the MD11 and they came out with the MD12, which was just the same thing. Nowadays, if you're buying them, if you have an FE or an FM or an FE2 or an FM2, which came later, all of those cameras will use an MD11 or an MD12. They're interchangeable. So, and everybody wanted these things. And they were not cheap. They didn't say NIKON on it. They said Nikon, and people had to pay a price. An FE was easily $400, and the FM was not much lower than that. And so Nikon had a good problem. They were selling stuff that they had, but they also were missing out on part of the market because there was a lot of people who wanted a camera and they wanted a Nikon, but they couldn't justify spending $400 for it and then getting lenses, because all the Nikon stuff is really good, but it's really expensive. So Nikon in '79 came up with this other idea, and that is, we're going to combine copying Olympus and copying Canon with the camera and see how that works out. We're going to make it a Nikon camera, but it's going to be made out of plastic. It's going to have lenses that are made out of plastic, and it's going to be electronic and very basic. But they wanted to keep it a Nikon, so they did something that you didn't see much of, and that is that this camera, which is called an EM, notice the E, we used to see an EL there on the Nichromat, and now you see it becomes EM up here, the triangle on the top of the pentaprism. But this one, this was a basic beginner camera, low price. This one sold with its lens for about $200 or under, which was great in 1979. That was, and people wanted to have a Nikon, and all of a sudden, like, you get a Nikon for $200. I want the EM, and it was cute and little and popular and lightweight, and it had accessories because they made a whole family of these, and they sold them faster than they could make them. There was so much demand for them. But I mentioned that they made it a real Nikon camera because even though this, like so many electronic cameras in the late 70s and into the 80s, could operate only electronically, they gave this a manual M90 shutter speed. So if your batteries die, you don't have a dead camera, you still can use that 1/90th of a second shutter speed. And they also had a flash to use with this one, the SB series flashes, and they had an SBE for the E series. And they had something else which we have attached to this one, which of course is the subject today. Now, remember I told you earlier that not everything is working, and I had been waiting for this to come here. I found a real reasonable price on this motor drive, but part of the real reasonable price means it might not work. And this one looks like it's going to work, but I haven't been able to get it to work. And this is interesting because it takes not 4 AA's, but 6 AA's. And I've been doing the best I can with my eyes to read the box for the AAA, because I don't usually use AAA's, but I wonder if AAA batteries are 6 volt instead of 6.5 volt, because they're so tiny, because this seems like it would be the right thing. But let's talk about what we see here, this motor drive. All right, so with the FM FE cameras, we had the MD11 and the MD12. And what's the next number? MD13, yes. How many products do you see for sale that are model 13? That's always, it's Friday the 13th. It's considered bad luck or dangerous or scary or something, the number 13. So Nikon didn't want to make an MD13. As a matter of fact, what they were looking at, because it was inexpensive, because it was easily built, mass-produced, and something that was not going to be under high-stress situations like taking it into battlefields in wartime. So they kind of learned their lesson from the AutoWinder 1, and they applied it to here, because what they had is they didn't want to use the term AutoWinder again, and they didn't want to use the number 13 again, so they made this AutoWinder a motor drive, because Nikon called it that. It's got more than 4 batteries, but it's supposed to just be 2 frames per second. This AutoWinder, unlike the Canon AutoWinder or the Minolta AutoWinder, it has a little bitty grip that sticks up out of it, up here, that you can grab hold of when you hold it. And this is called an MD for motor drive E, because it's E series, and it looks like that. I get, oh, it says it on it. I got to take it off to get it to show it to you. But we have an E series lens, we have an Nikon EM camera, a MDE wind motor drive, and an SBE Nikon flash unit, all that goes on this. And there was a number of lenses, a 28mm, 35, a 50, 85, a 100, and a zoom or two that were all Series E lenses, like you see here. So that's the Series E, and this was the beginning of the E family. So we got to look at the E family, but we're going by date order. So we got this other one up here. This was the camera of 1980, and this was the F3, very important camera for Nikon, and a very impressive motor drive. This one is still has one counter on it, right here, and a little wheel you can turn to set the counter to where you want it. Mine happens to have a data back on it, but doesn't have any batteries in it. This came, when I bought this in the 80s, it had the data back attached, although I wouldn't have anything to do with it. But it seems to seal up pretty good, even all these years later. It doesn't leak any light, so it's safe. And there's no battery to go bad because I took the battery out. But speaking of taking the batteries out, let's look at this Nikon motor drive. It takes 8 AA batteries. Let's look in here. So it's 12 volt, and it is definitely a motor drive because it will really drive. Let's see. Oh, hear that? That's pretty fast, isn't it? Yeah, this is a real motor drive, you can tell. And that was, it will go even faster if you lock the mirror up, which you just do with the button, turn this thing there. That's the mirror locked up. Let's see. See if we can hear a difference. Can we hear a difference now? Probably quieter. That's with the mirror locked up. I can let the mirror back down so the camera can be usable again. There. All right, this is the Nikon MD4. And they put the Nikon name right on the front of the camera now. This is meant to be camera and motor drive as a regular unit together. You usually see people that have the F3, they're going to have an MD4 with it. It doesn't have a separate battery pack. It just has the battery compartment, which you eject out. And this is Nikon's longest running professional series camera. The F ran for about 12 years. The F2 ran for about 9 years. The F3 came out in 1980, and they were still making it in 2000, and it continued on into the 21st century for a while. I think they're not making them now, but it had been around for a long time. And it was the one camera that didn't get replaced by one that followed it. When Nikon came out with the F2, the F was discontinued. When they came out with this F3, the F2 was discontinued. When they came out with the F4, the F3 was still being sold and made. The F4 went autofocus, but a lot of pros didn't want that at the time. It was not a very good autofocus system. So the F4 came and went, was replaced by the F5, and the F3 was still being marketed and sold and produced by Nikon. And I think the F6 and the F3 was still in there when the F5 was gone. And I guess they're in 7 or 8 or something now. They're in all electronic stuff, which is different. But this one just hung on there for forever. And these things now, this shows it, they sell for the same price or more expensive than they were back in 1980. So this is a really great camera. The motordrive, which is what we're talking about here, has a couple of interesting features on it. You've taken a look at it, but this one has film rewind. Let's see. Press this. There's a button I pushed down. Where's that? Here. There, I push this here and this here. See that? This comes up inside here and rewinds the film. Like that. So that's automatic film rewind, and when it gets to the end you hear it go click, 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 click as it goes around inside there, and the end of the film sticking out and the leader. So this rewinds film. And the other feature which Nikon thought up, and it was a brilliant feature, because the F3 was the first all electronic professional grade camera that Nikon had. It's just like we saw on the EM. It has a manual 1/90th of a second, which will flash sync, and you can, if your batteries die, you can use that. But nobody had their batteries died on their F3, and when I bought this one, I bought it used, and I took the batteries out of it pretty quickly because I didn't want to have them in there just asking for trouble. I took them out of the data back, and I took them out of the inside of the camera, because the other great feature about this is this camera, when attached to the motor drive, will run off the motor drive batteries. And I think Pentax did that with the LX, but that was it. Nobody else ever thought of that. But Nikon used it, and they'll use it again. We'll see in a minute. But that was the other feature, is it had rewind, which the MD1 and MD2 had on the F2s, but not the MD3. But you got it on the 4 here, on the MD4. So rewind and camera powered by your motor drive batteries, so it keeps going. So this is a great camera, one of the greatest cameras ever made, and a lot of it because of this motor drive that comes with it. So that was 1980. What is Nikon going to do now? Well, they are not done. They still have some tricks up their sleeve. Remember, the EM that we saw was a very popular camera, and it was really inexpensive. Well, that came out in 1979. In 1982, Nikon came out with a new camera, which is a member of the EM family. And this is the main guy here. This is the big time. This is the Nikon FG. I think you can see it there, right? FG. And the FG is basically, it's on the platform of the EM, but it's got all manual speeds, it's got automatic exposure, and it's got programmed exposure, and it has its own motor drive to it. This is, oh yeah, this is, I'll tell you that. This is an 8-cell little tiny motor drive. It has 8 AA's in there, and can really go. Put this thing on fast. It doesn't have a shutter button. All it has is a little switch on the back, and that's the only controls that it has, is that. But listen to this little sucker. Isn't that awesome? It's it'll go pretty darn fast. They say that it's 3.2 seconds or 3.2 frames per second. That's burning up film pretty fast. But here you have a little EM-sized camera. It's kind of funny here if you look. See, you see it gets, this motor drive kind of sticks out past the end of the side of the camera here. So it's the smaller cameras, they can fit, and it kind of a muffin top over here on it as it hangs over. But this is the, or what we had, MDE for the 13. So this is the MD14 motor drive. And this, the FG camera, and in the next year they came out with the FG20, which didn't sell very much, which was an intermediate camera. This was the high-end camera. The EM was the low end, and the FG20 was in the middle. Didn't have program exposure. This even had through the lens flash exposure, which you never heard of on a camera like this. A beginner camera. This is not a beginner camera. This is like more of a pro camera that's really small and light, made out of plastic. It has an auto winder on it with no button. But this, followed by the FG20, rounded out the EM series of cameras. It was meant for that, but because it had this motor drive on it instead of the MDE, it had an MD14, and it could use either one. The MDE was interchangeable on the FG, FG20, and the EM. You can put this MD14 on the EM if you want, but be forewarned, it was not meant for a 12-volt motor. So I put it on, and it works. It works, but it's that's how I know that the EM works, but the MDE that I just got doesn't work. So this one will work on that EM just fine. So MD14. We're almost at the end here. If you're staying with me, because you want to know about all of these, and finish up where we kind of started off, right on that corner there. This is the final one, 1983. Nikon came out with this, and this is so sad because this is a great camera and a really great setup, and an MD15. That's as far as Nikon is going to go, to MD15, because after this, all future motor drives will be, for Nikon, will be integral to the camera. They're not going to be removable. You can have a removable battery pack on some of them, but no more removable motor drives. Okay, all motor drives are going to be built in after this. So the 83 was the end of the line. This is the last of the manual focus Nikons, and this was a brilliant camera. It is made on the platform of the FM, FE, FM2, FE2, FM10, and this is called the Nikon FA. And it will run on a motordrive 11 or an MD12, or it will run on its own MD15 and Nikon paid attention to this when they put that on there, because just like that top line MD4 motor drive that worked on the F3, the FA motor drive, the MD15, will power all camera functions. Now, I told you this is sad here. The battery chamber here has this little key that you turn to do it. And watch in there, see that? Then you just pull it out, and there's your battery chamber. Guess what? This battery chamber that I have on my MD15 came from the MD14. They are interchangeable. The motor drives themselves are not interchangeable, but the correct battery chamber for this motor drive is on the MD14, and it's an MD15. So you can swap them out. That's one way you can kind of test to see what's working and what's not working. The other thing is that my FA camera doesn't work with AA batteries, not AA's, with the button cells in the bottom of it, in the battery compartment. I've cleaned the battery compartment, but I can't get it to work. But when I hook up the MD15 with its 8 batteries in it, and it's attached to the bottom of the camera, all of a sudden everything in the camera comes to life, and the camera works. But you know what doesn't work? The button on the motor drive. See, it's clicking, it's making its travel, but it won't fire. The only way with the motor drive on it I can fire it is and I get the finder, the information in the finder, all that, everything works there because it gets the power from the motor drive, but it doesn't get the power from the batteries inside. So I can work this camera with the motor drive, but the motor drive doesn't work. I thought, oh, well, let me check it out. I'll put the camera on the MD11, but the MD11 does not power the camera. So I can't test it on the MD11. And I can't put the FE on the MD15 because the MD15 only takes the FA. So all these different winders, all these different motor drives, and all this history of all these Nikon products that were so popular, and that covers history of Nikon motor drives. I know this has been a long video, so if you stay there, you get extra thumbs up just for hanging in there and watching it. You need the watch hours on the channel. I'm trying to get up to 4,000, and I'm just stuck a little below that. So watch it to the end, and watch it again if you can. Thank you for stopping by. I hope you find this interesting, even though it covered a lot of subjects, and you have been excellent students to pay attention here. So until next time, this is Mr. Gibson Guy, and I'm out of here. Bye.